Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Train That Arrived Without Its Passengers. Chapter 1. The Ghost Express of King's Cross. The autumn of 1895 had descended upon London with particular cruelty, wrapping the city in a damp, suffocating fog that pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street like a living thing. Watson had spent the better part of that Tuesday evening attempting to read, though the words of his novel had ceased to reach him some time past. Across the room, Sherlock Holmes lay draped across the settee in a manner that suggested either profound thought or profound indolence. Watson had long since learned that the two were, in Holmes's case, frequently indistinguishable. It was precisely 20 minutes past 9 when the bell below rang with the urgent, rhythmic insistence of a man who believed his troubles could not possibly wait. "A railway official," said Holmes without opening his eyes. "He has walked quickly and without pause from a carriage that deposited him at the far end of the street. His left boot heel strikes harder than his right, suggesting a man who leans into urgency rather than circumstance. We shall have company in 40 seconds, Watson." Watson set down his book and reached instinctively for his notebook. He had long ago abandoned any pretense of surprise at such pronouncements, though he confessed privately that they never failed to quicken his pulse. The man who entered their sitting-room 2 minutes later, Holmes's estimate being slightly generous, owing to Mrs. Hudson's deliberate pace on the staircase, was indeed a railway official. He wore the pressed dark uniform of the Great Northern Railway, though the top button of his collar had been hastily unfastened, and his round face shone with the sheen of a man who had been sweating through cold air. He carried his cap in both hands, turning it in slow, anxious circles. "Mr. Holmes," he said breathlessly, "my name is Arthur Fenwick. I am the night supervisor at King's Cross Terminus. I was told, that is, Inspector Lestrade suggested, that is to say, I have been told that you are the man one comes to when a thing has no earthly explanation." "Sit down, Mr. Fenwick," said Holmes, now swinging his legs to the floor with the sudden alertness of a cat that has spotted movement. "Watson, pour the man something warming. He has come from King's Cross on foot for the last quarter-mile, having dismissed his cab in agitation, and his constitution has not entirely agreed with the night air." Fenwick collapsed into the basket chair and accepted the brandy Watson pressed upon him with trembling gratitude. "Tell us," said Holmes, pressing his fingertips together beneath his chin, "about the 9:47 from Grimthorpe." Fenwick nearly dropped his glass. "How on God's green earth could you possibly— You are the night supervisor at King's Cross. A man of your seniority does not leave his post during the evening rush unless something has rendered the entire operation meaningless. The 9:47 is the last express service from Grimthorpe Junction on a Tuesday. The fact that you are here, rather than managing whatever chaos has ensued, suggests the chaos is of a nature that cannot be managed by procedure. Now, tell me precisely what happened." Fenwick drew a long, shuddering breath. "The 9:47 from Grimthorpe," he began slowly, "departed that station at the scheduled time, fully loaded. The station master at Grimthorpe, a Mr. Aldous Crane, personally confirmed the passenger manifest at departure. 112 passengers, 6 carriages, a full crew, driver, fireman, 2 conductors, and a guard. And," Holmes said softly, "and it arrived at King's Cross at 11:14, 3 minutes behind schedule, which is perfectly normal on account of the fog. The locomotive arrived, Mr. Holmes. The carriages arrived. The locomotive was still warm, the boiler still running. Every lamp was lit inside every carriage. The luggage was undisturbed in the guard's van. Every bag, every trunk, every parcel, still sitting exactly where it had been loaded." Fenwick paused, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but there was not a single living soul on board that train. Not one passenger, not a conductor, not the guard, not even the driver or the fireman. 117 people, Mr. Holmes, vanished between Grimthorpe Junction and King's Cross from a moving train on a foggy Tuesday night, without a single door being opened, without a single emergency cord being pulled, and without anyone at any of the 4 intermediate stations seeing or hearing a thing. The room was utterly silent for a long moment. Watson stared at his notebook, pen suspended uselessly above the page. Holmes had not moved, but something had changed in his eyes. A light had come into them, sharp and cold and brilliant as a winter star. "Extraordinary," said Holmes quietly, and then, with unmistakable pleasure, "quite extraordinarily extraordinary." "Lestrade is at King's Cross now," said Fenwick. "He said if anyone could make sense of this, it was you. He's not touched the train, kept everyone well back. But the press will have it by morning, and there will be a panic the like of which—" "Watson," said Holmes, already rising and reaching for his coat. "Your hat and gloves, if you please. Mr. Fenwick, you will accompany us, and ensure we have unrestricted access to every carriage of that train. I shall want to speak with whoever first discovered the empty carriages, whoever received the manifest from Grimthorpe, and the signalman who cleared the train through the last junction before London." Holmes paused at the door, his eyes gleaming. 117 people do not simply cease to exist, Mr. Fenwick. They go somewhere, and wherever they have gone, they have left a trail that I intend to follow to its very end. They descended to Baker Street, where the fog swallowed them whole, and London's gaslit night received them without ceremony. Chapter 2. The Evidence that Refused to Speak King's Cross. At midnight, possessed an atmosphere of peculiar desolation that Watson found deeply unsettling. The great arched terminus, ordinarily humming with the commerce of human movement, stood muffled and eerily still. Platform 7 had been cordoned with rope, and 2 constables, who straightened visibly at Fenwick's approach and Watson's, though they positively snapped to attention when they recognized the lean, hawk-faced figure behind them. Inspector Lestrade stood at the locomotive's cab, notebook open, expression conveying the particular mixture of bafflement and relief that Watson had come to associate with the man's more challenging encounters with Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with a curt nod, "thank you for coming." "You have touched nothing?" Holmes asked, already moving along the length of the train with long, purposeful strides. "Not a stick, though I'll confess I've looked through the carriage windows, and I've had a man on the roof to confirm there's nobody hiding up there." "And there is not," Holmes said. It was not a question. The roof would be the first thing any reasonably competent investigator examined, which means it is also the first hiding place any reasonably competent criminal would have anticipated and discarded. He paused at the door of the first passenger carriage and withdrew a small electric torch from his coat pocket, one of the newer varieties, which Watson had not previously seen him carry. "I shall begin at the rear and work forward. Watson, you will please take the second carriage and note the precise arrangement of every article left behind. Do not move anything, do not speculate, simply observe and record." Watson took himself to the second carriage and stepped inside with the careful reverence of a man entering a crime scene. What he found there was, in its own way, more disturbing than any scene of obvious violence he had attended in Holmes's company. The carriage was warm, the heating pipes still ticking quietly, and brightly lit by its oil lamps. 8 compartments, each with seating for 6 passengers, and in those compartments, the casual, intimate detritus of human occupation was everywhere. In the third compartment, a woman's glove lay on the seat beside a small paperback novel. Its spine cracked open at page 47, a thin sliver of pressed violet marking the reader's place. On the seat opposite sat a gentleman's briefcase, unlatched, with documents fanned slightly across the cushion, as though its owner had been reviewing them. A hat, a respectable brown bowler, rested upon the luggage rack directly above. In the 5th compartment, a child's wooden horse sat upright on the window ledge, and beside it, a small paper bag of boiled sweets, the top twisted closed. 3 compartments contained food in various states of consumption, a ham sandwich with 1 bite taken, a flask of cold tea still stoppered, half a meat pie in a paper wrapper. Nobody had been frightened away. Nobody had been given time to gather their belongings. Everything suggested a company of passengers who had simply ceased to be present in the middle of ongoing existence. Watson was recording his observations with disciplined attention When Holmes appeared at the carriage door, the detective had removed his gloves and was examining something on his fingertips with the aid of the electric torch. "What have you found?" Watson asked. "Rather more interesting to ask what I have not found," Holmes replied, stepping inside. "There is no sign of violence in any of the 6 carriages I have examined. No blood, no broken glass, no evidence of struggle. The communication cords in every compartment are intact and have not been pulled. The exterior door handles show no unusual wear, suggesting multiple rapid openings. And yet—" He paused, crouching to examine the floor of the 3rd compartment with his torch angled at a shallow degree. "And yet," Watson prompted, "the floor of this carriage has been subjected to some chemical agent. Very faint, barely detectable but present. A faint, sweetish residue, here along the base of the seats." Holmes produced a small glass vial from his waistcoat and scraped a minute sample from the skirting board. "I shall need the laboratory to be certain, but my preliminary assessment is that it is consistent with compounds used in certain theatrical applications. Specifically, the kind of application in which one wishes an enclosed space to be briefly rendered rather more conducive to unconsciousness than to wakefulness." Watson stared at him. "You mean the passengers were drugged?" Holmes said simply. "Or at least I strongly suspect it. But observe, Watson. If passengers were drugged, they did not simply dissolve. They had to go somewhere, through doors that show no unusual wear, from a moving train that stopped at no unscheduled location." Holmes straightened and looked the length of the carriage with an expression of intense concentration. "There is something else I have noticed, though I am not yet prepared to share its significance. Come, Lestrade will want to discuss the intermediate stations." Inspector Lestrade had assembled what information he possessed on the platform. The 9:47 from Grimthorpe had passed through 4 intermediate stations: Hatfield, Potter's Bar, New Barnet, and Finsbury Park. At each station, the train had slowed to its scheduled speed, not stopped, for it was a non-stopping express, and the platform staff at each location had confirmed that the train had passed through normally. No doors open, no disturbance, no unusual sounds. At Finsbury Park, the platform supervisor, a Mr. Theodore Marsh, had specifically noted that the train appeared entirely normal as it passed through at speed, its windows lit and interior visible. He had observed what he took to be passengers in at least 3 of the carriage windows. "What he took to be passengers," Holmes repeated, his eyes narrowing. "Describe his exact words, Lestrade." Lestrade consulted his notebook. "He says, and I quote, 'The carriages were lit and there were shapes in the windows, just as you'd expect.'" "Shapes?" said Holmes softly. "Not people. Shapes. Mr. Fenwick, what is the distance between Finsbury Park and King's Cross Terminus?" "Approximately 4.5 miles, sir." "And at the speed of an express train slowing for final approach. What is the elapsed time?" 7 to 9 minutes, depending on fog conditions." 7 to 9 minutes, Holmes repeated. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the side of the locomotive. Then, "I wish to speak to the signalmen at every box between Grimthorpe and this station. I wish to examine the permanent way, specifically the sidings and passing loops. At 3 locations I shall identify in the morning. And I wish to speak with the station master at Grimthorpe, Mr. Crane, first thing tomorrow." He turned to Watson. "We shall stay at the Great Northern Hotel tonight. I shan't sleep, but the pretence will at least give me an uninterrupted space in which to think." As they departed the platform, Watson looked back once at the silent train, its windows still glowing warm in the cold terminus. The little wooden horse sat undisturbed in the second carriage window, watching them leave with painted, unseeing eyes. Chapter 3. Grimthorpe Junction in the morning light. Grimthorpe was a town that had grown prosperous on the intersection of 2 things: coal and railways. It sat some 40 miles north of London in a shallow valley that the Great Northern Line traversed with the casual authority of modern progress, and it wore its industrial wealth with the slightly embarrassed air of a man who has come into money too quickly to know what to do with it. Fine buildings stood beside soot-stained warehouses, Broad Victorian streets petered out abruptly into muddy lanes, and the junction station itself was an ambitious structure whose ornamental ironwork had been quietly surrendering to rust for the better part of a decade. Holmes and Watson arrived on the 7:15 from King's Cross. Holmes having not, as far as Watson could determine, slept at all, and were met on the platform by two men whose natures could not have been more dissimilar. The first was Aldous Crane, station master, a compact and precise man of perhaps 55 years, who wore his uniform as though it had been constructed specifically for the performance of duty. His grey moustache was exactly trimmed, his posture excellent, and his manner conveyed the quiet authority of a man who had spent 3 decades ensuring that the mechanical and human elements of a complex enterprise arrived at the same place at the same time. The second man was Inspector Cornelius Vane of the Grimthorpe Constabulary, a tall, angular individual with the unhappy eyes of someone who has been asked to understand something that does not wish to be understood. He shook Holmes's hand with the brisk efficiency of a man performing a duty rather than extending a welcome. "Extraordinary business," said Crane, as he led them to his office. "I have been the station master at this junction for 19 years. I have seen accidents, delays, derailments. I have never seen anything remotely like this." "Tell me about the 947's departure," said Holmes, declining the offered chair, and instead moving to examine the large wall-mounted schedule board. With as much precision as you can manage. Crane drew himself up slightly and proceeded with the exactness of a man recounting from memory he trusted completely. The 947 had been assembled in the station yard from its standard consist: a Great Northern Class M locomotive, tender, 6 passenger carriages, and a guard's van. Crane had personally walked the platform at 9:35, confirming the presence of passengers on board. The passenger manifest had been compiled by his own staff from ticket purchases and platform checks. 112 confirmed passengers. He had shaken hands with the driver, a man named Robert Fleck with 17 years' service, and exchanged a brief word with the guard, Leonard Poole, a reliable man of long experience. "And the crew were in good spirits?" Holmes asked. "Perfectly normal." Fleck made a comment about the fog. Poole was reading a newspaper. The conductors, 2 men, Hargreaves and Birch, were already on board checking tickets. "You observed no unusual passengers, no large groups travelling together, no evidence of cargo being loaded in the passenger carriages rather than the guard's van?" Crane paused. "There was one group that was slightly unusual. A party of, I believe, 14 or 15 individuals, who arrived together and boarded the second and third carriages. They appeared to be some form of organised group. They were quiet and well behaved, and their tickets were all in order." Holmes turned from the schedule board. "Describe them. Respectable working-class men mostly, middling ages. They carried identical canvas bags, the kind a working man uses for tools or equipment. They did not engage with the other passengers. Their tickets had all been purchased at the same London agency. I noticed because they were the same stock, same colour." "Did any of your staff speak to them?" Hargreaves spoke to their apparent leader, a broad, well-built man, dark-haired, clean-shaven, to verify tickets. He reported nothing irregular. Holmes sat down suddenly and pressed both hands flat on the desk with an expression of intense concentration. "Inspector Vane," he said, without looking up, "was anyone in Grimthorpe aware that a distinguished or wealthy individual was travelling on the 947? Vane blinked. "As a matter of fact, yes. That's rather the reason we're involved at all. Lord Ambrose Castleton, the 3rd Baron Castleton, was booked on that train. He is a significant figure in the coal industry, owns 3 collieries within 20 miles of here, and had been in Grimthorpe for a meeting with his solicitors. He was travelling back to London with his personal secretary, a Mr. Gerald Hume." "Were there any others of significance?" "A young woman named Miss Dorothea Ashworth, daughter of Sir Reginald Ashworth. She had been visiting relatives in the area, and a Mr. Samuel Price, who is understood to be carrying documents relating to a rather substantial land transaction." Holmes looked up at Watson with an expression the doctor had long ago learned to interpret, the expression of a man who has just heard exactly what he expected to hear. and found it simultaneously satisfying and deeply alarming. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "I believe our missing passengers did not vanish by accident. They were taken quite deliberately." The question of how they were taken from a moving train remains technically fascinating, but the question of why, that, I think, will prove considerably more illuminating. Chapter 4. The Marks upon the Permanent Way. Holmes spent the remainder of that morning engaged in an activity that Inspector Vane found baffling and Watson found physically exhausting: walking the railway line. Not merely examining it from a distance, but walking its entire 40-mile length in a series of targeted inspections that Holmes had identified from a careful study of the Ordnance Survey maps spread across Crane's office floor. He had marked 6 specific locations with a blue pencil, studying the topography with an attention that Watson, peering over his shoulder, could not immediately explain. "What are we looking for?" Watson asked, as they picked their way along the ballast beside the northbound track some 6 miles south of Grimthorpe. "Evidence of a stop that did not appear in any schedule and was not observed by any signalman," Holmes replied, moving with the deliberate care of a man who knows that the ground beneath him is speaking, if he will only listen. But the signalmen reported nothing unusual, quite, and the signalmen would only know what their instruments and observations told them. An express train travelling at speed in fog, with its lamps lit, passing a signal box at the expected time. The signalman clears it and records it as normal. He does not know whether the train he saw was the same train that left Grimthorpe. Holmes paused, crouching to examine a section of track. "Watson, come here." Watson crouched beside him. In the grey morning light he could see nothing remarkable: the 2 rails, the wooden sleepers, the grey ballast stones. But Holmes was pointing at a spot on the inner rail with his pencil. "What do you see?" Watson looked more carefully. "A scratch on the inside of the rail. 2 scratches, parallel, approximately 6 inches apart, and interrupted. They run for perhaps 4 feet and then stop. The rail surface here is slightly depressed, the ballast slightly displaced." Holmes stood, shading his eyes against the pale sun, to look along the track in both directions. Perhaps 30 yards further south, he moved to the trackside and knelt again, this time examining the rough grass of the embankment. Freshly pressed vegetation, heavy impressions in the soft earth, here and here. These are made by something mechanical. And here, he pointed to a faint dark stain on a large stone at the embankment's base. "Lubricating oil." "What does it mean?" "It means that at some point, I believe within the last 48 hours, a piece of equipment was positioned here beside this track. Something with wheels, something heavy, something that required lubrication." Holmes straightened and looked toward a dense coppice of trees that ran along the eastern side of the embankment for perhaps a quarter mile. And those trees would have provided very effective concealment from any signal box, any farmhouse, and any passing road. They investigated 2 more of Holmes's marked locations before finding what Watson would later describe in his notes as the most significant discovery of the early investigation. At a point 8 miles south of Grimthorpe, in a shallow cutting where the track curved gently eastward, and where an old loading siding, long disused, its rails overgrown and its connection to the main line switched to the closed position, ran off into a stand of elms, Holmes found a section of ground that had clearly been subject to intensive recent activity. The siding connection switch had been manually operated. Holmes confirmed this by the marks on the lever housing, fresh scratches in the rust, clean grease on the operating mechanism. The siding itself had been cleared of at least some of its vegetation. The cut stems were fresh, the cut ends not yet browned, and on the siding track itself, for a length of perhaps 200 yards before it disappeared into the trees, there were the unmistakable marks of heavy-wheeled traffic, the pressed-down rust, the scored ballast, the barely visible impressions of something enormous having sat on those long-abandoned rails. "They stopped the train here," Watson said slowly. "They switched it onto this siding." "No," said Holmes. "That is the attractive, obvious conclusion, which is precisely why I distrust it. This siding cannot accommodate a full 6-carriage express. The track ends at the tree line. I can see that from here. And the siding connection, while freshly used, shows a very specific pattern of operation. He was silent for a moment, examining something on the siding rails with his magnifying glass. No, this siding was used for something else, something that came from the siding to the main line rather than the other way around. He straightened abruptly and walked to the edge of the tree line, disappearing briefly into the elms. Watson heard him moving through the undergrowth and waited with the particular patience he had developed over years of standing at the edges of Holmes's investigations, holding his notebook and resisting the impulse to interrupt. When Holmes emerged, his trousers were muddy to the knee, and his expression was one of intense, barely contained excitement. "There is a farm track through those trees," he said. "It joins a secondary road approximately half a mile to the east, and in the soft mud of that track, there are the fresh wheel marks of at least 6 heavy vehicles. Wagons, Watson. Large ones." Watson stared at him. "You think the passengers were transferred?" "To road vehicles, yes. Under cover of those trees, in the darkness. But the mechanics of how a moving express train was stopped and its passengers removed without the knowledge of the signal network remains the critical question." Holmes began walking back along the track. "And I believe the answer lies not with the railway at all, but with something that was placed on that train before it ever left Grimthorpe Station." Chapter 5. The Curious Affair of the Canvas Bags. They returned to London that afternoon, Holmes characteristically silent for most of the journey, his eyes fixed on the passing countryside, with the inward focus of a man watching something that was not there. Watson occupied himself with organizing his notes, which had accumulated with the productive density of a case that kept offering new surfaces to scratch. At Baker Street, Holmes went directly to his chemical bench and spent an hour with the samples he had taken from the carriages, while Watson made a pot of tea that went largely undrunk. At length Holmes pushed back his stool and announced his findings with the precision of a man who has confirmed what he suspected and is now prepared to proceed. "Chloral hydrate," he said, "combined with a petroleum-based carrier compound designed to facilitate rapid vaporization in an enclosed, ventilated space. The concentration I found on the carriage floors was not high enough to cause deep or prolonged unconsciousness. Perhaps 30 minutes of deep sleep, perhaps 45, followed by a period of grogginess and disorientation. It would be sufficient for a well-organized team to move a large number of insensible passengers." He paused. "It also explains something I noticed in the carriages but did not immediately mention. Every ventilation grate in every carriage had been modified. Very subtly, whoever did it knew precisely what they were doing. The grills had been replaced with nearly identical versions that incorporated small channels for the introduction of gas from below the carriage floor." "My God," said Watson. "That's extraordinary planning." "It is extraordinary in its scale," Holmes agreed. "The modification of 6 sets of carriage ventilation grills, the preparation of a chemical dispersal system beneath the floor. This could not have been done in a single night. It required advanced knowledge of which carriages would form the consist of the 947, which means either someone within the Great Northern Railway's rolling stock department was involved, or someone had access to the yard at Grimthorpe where the train was assembled." He rose and went to the map of the railway line he had pinned to the wall. "Now, the canvas bags." Watson looked up from his notes. Crane mentioned a group of men carrying identical canvas bags. 14 or 15 men, quiet, organized, travelling together on tickets from the same London agency. Canvas bags of the type a working man might carry, meaning bags large enough to carry tools, or, alternatively, large enough to carry equipment for the rapid, systematic unloading of insensible passengers from a train that has been briefly halted on a disused siding. Holmes tapped the map at the location of the siding he and Watson had visited that morning. "They were the removal crew, Watson. They boarded at Grimthorpe, travelled with the passengers, and when the train stopped by a method we have not yet determined, they carried out their work. But the train was never reported stopped. The signalman, said Holmes, cleared the train and recorded it as passing at the expected time. This means either the train was stopped in a section of line between two signal boxes, and the stop was brief enough to fall within the normal variance of the express schedule, or Holmes paused, and his expression became one of deep abstraction. The signalmen were not watching the section of track in question at the precise moment it was required. Fog, Watson. Heavy fog. A signal box supervisor who steps away from his window for 3 minutes to stoke his fire. It is not impossible. You said something was placed on the train before it left Grimthorpe. The gas delivery system. The grill modifications, yes. But there is something else. The method of stopping the train. I believe the driver and fireman were affected first, separately from the passenger carriages, and by a different delivery mechanism. The locomotive cab would require a different approach, and I suspect the answer lies in the locomotive's water supply or its fuel tender. Holmes turned from the map. We need to speak with someone who knows the inner workings of Great Northern locomotives at a level of rather unusual detail. I have 1 or 2 contacts who may be helpful. He crossed to his desk and wrote 2 telegrams in rapid succession. As he sealed them, there was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson admitted a young woman whose appearance immediately struck Watson as combining considerable agitation with considerable determination. She was perhaps 24 years of age, with dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that moved immediately to Holmes, with the directness of someone who has been told exactly who she is looking for. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "my name is Clara Fleck. Robert Fleck was my father. He was the driver of that train. Scotland Yard will not tell me anything. I need to know what has happened to him." Holmes regarded her for a moment. "Sit down, Miss Fleck," he said, with a gentleness that Watson recognized as genuine, "and tell me everything your father said to you in the week before Tuesday." Chapter 6. What the driver's daughter knew. Clara Fleck was not a woman easily rattled. Watson could tell this from the way she sat. Not with the brittle composure of someone suppressing panic, but with the straight-backed steadiness of a person who has decided that composure is the most useful tool available to her. She had come prepared, with a small leather satchel that she held on her lap, and she answered Holmes's questions with the concise clarity of someone who has been rehearsing the telling. Her father, Robert Fleck, had been a driver with the Great Northern Railway for 17 years. He was 51 years old, in excellent health, and had driven the Grimthorpe Express route more times than he could count. He was a careful man, a methodical man, Clara's choice of words, but spoken with the quiet conviction of filial knowledge. He did not drink, he did not gamble, he maintained his locomotive with the devotion of a craftsman. He had 2 grandchildren whom he adored, and a vegetable garden that he considered his secondary vocation. In the week before Tuesday, Clara said, "My father mentioned something that I have been trying to decide whether to tell the police. I decided it was too important not to." "You were correct," Holmes said. "Please continue." "On Friday, 4 days before the train disappeared, my father came for dinner. He was quieter than usual, and at one point he said something that struck me as odd. He said that a man had approached him in the locomotive yard at Grimthorpe, a man he did not know, and had offered him a sum of money, a considerable sum. My father didn't tell me how much, but he used the word considerable, and my father is not a man who uses that word loosely." She paused. "The man said my father would not have to do anything except drive his train as he always did. He said the train would stop by itself. His exact words, my father said, and that my father should not be alarmed by what happened next. The money was for his silence afterward." Holmes leaned forward fractionally. "What did your father do?" "He refused, Mr. Holmes. Immediately and completely. He was furious. He came home furious. He said he told the man where he could put his money, and reported the approach to his depot foreman at Grimthorpe the following morning." "And did the depot foreman take any action?" Clara's expression shifted, the first crack in her composure. "He says he did. He says he wrote a report and submitted it to the railway's security office. But when I asked the security office yesterday, they told me they had no record of any such report." Holmes was very still. "The depot foreman's name?" "Harker. James Harker." Holmes glanced at Watson with the briefly exchanged look of two men who have just heard the same significant thing. Then he said, "You mentioned a satchel, Miss Fleck. You brought it with purpose." Clara unclasped the satchel and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "My father left this at my house on Sunday, 2 days before the Tuesday run. He said it was nothing, just something he'd written down in case it was ever needed. He said I was not to worry." She unfolded the paper on the desk. "I think he was worried." Watson craned to see. The paper contained a list of names, 7 of them, written in the careful block letters of a working man unaccustomed to writing as communication rather than record. Against each name was a brief notation, a date, a railway designation, and in some cases a monetary figure. Holmes read it once, then again. His expression did not change, but Watson saw his right hand, resting on the desk, close slowly around his pencil. "Miss Fleck," Holmes said, "your father was an observant man. These names, did he explain any of them to you?" "He said they were all railway employees, men he knew by sight or by reputation. He said he had seen 2 of them speaking to the same stranger who had approached him." "James Harker's name is not on this list," Holmes observed. "No," said Clara, "but there is a gap at the bottom of the page." "My father's pen ran out of ink," he was going to continue. Holmes folded the paper and placed it in his inside pocket. "Miss Fleck, I want you to leave London for a few days. Relatives, somewhere outside the city. Do not tell anyone except Watson and me where you are going, and do not return until you hear from me directly." Clara stared at him. "You believe I'm in danger. I believe your father's refusal to be bribed means someone has an unsettled problem, and I believe that problem will not be settled by the disappearance of 117 people. Go tonight, Miss Fleck." After she had gone, Watson turned to Holmes with the question already formed. 7 names, Holmes said, before Watson could speak. 6 of them are railway employees, rolling stock, scheduling, signalling. The 7th is not. The 7th is a man named D. Wetherall, with a notation indicating the sum of £300 and a date 6 weeks ago. Holmes rose and went to his index. D. Wetherall. Let us see what Baker Street's Library of the Criminal World has to say. Chapter 7. The Wetherall Connection. The index yielded 1 entry, frustratingly thin. Desmond Wetherall, described in Holmes's notation as a former sergeant of engineers in the British Army, discharged in 1888, subsequently employed in the demolition and excavation trades. A capable man with machinery, a record of 2 minor infractions in connection with the illegal movement of explosives, and a known associate of certain organizations that Holmes had noted only as industrial agitators, possibly of a political nature. Not a common criminal, Holmes said, replacing the volume. A technician, a man with knowledge of mechanical systems, timing devices, and the controlled application of chemical or physical force. He lit his pipe and moved to the window, looking out at the fog-bound street below. And £300 is a great deal of money for a man of his former employment, but a very small fraction of what this enterprise must have cost to organize. Watson reviewed his notes. The target was not random. Castleton, the industrialist. Miss Ashworth, whose father controls considerable property. Price, carrying documents for a land transaction. But there were also 109 other passengers, ordinary people. The ordinary passengers are camouflage, Holmes said. An empty train would raise immediate alarm. A train whose entire complement of passengers has vanished is a mystery so overwhelming that the investigators, including Lestrade, including the railway company, and initially including myself, are paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the thing. While everyone stands at King's Cross in bewilderment, the real purpose, the removal of 3 specific individuals, is achieved and removed from the city entirely. But the ordinary passengers, where are they? Are they safe? I believe they are. Drugged, transported to some location away from London. Unconscious passengers do not observe their surroundings or remember their journey. But killing 109 innocent people would be an act of extraordinary risk and brutality. And everything about this operation speaks of surgical precision, not reckless violence. Holmes turned from the window. The question I keep returning to is the stopping mechanism. How was the train stopped without entering the awareness of the signal network? He went to his desk and retrieved the telegrams he had prepared. He had sent one to a contact at the Great Northern's Mechanical Engineering Department, and one to a retired locomotive driver named Archibald Penny, who had spent 20 years on the Grimthorpe line before his retirement. The replies had arrived during Clara Fleck's visit, and Holmes had set them aside. He read both now, his expression sharpening. Penny says there is a technique, ancient, known to every experienced driver on the Great Northern, called coasting the Barton Dip. Between the 6th and 7th milepost south of Grimthorpe, the line descends through a shallow cutting and then rises again over a stone bridge. A locomotive travelling through this section at normal speed requires no steam adjustment and, for approximately 90 seconds, the driver has historically reduced his attention on the instruments. It is not negligence, it is a function of the line's geography. Holmes set down the telegram. 90 seconds of reduced driver attention in a cutting that is invisible from the nearest signal box. Enough time to render the cab crew insensible and disengage the locomotive's automatic drive at the precise moment the train was passing the Barton siding. And the engineering contact? Watson asked. Holmes read from the second telegram. He confirms that a Great Northern locomotive's throttle can be disengaged by a remotely operated mechanical block if the block is installed on the throttle linkage beforehand. Such an installation would take an experienced engineer approximately 40 minutes in the locomotive yard. It would be invisible to a cursory pre-departure inspection. Watson was quiet for a moment. So the whole thing was prepared weeks in advance. The carriage modifications, the mechanical installation on the locomotive, the siding clearance, the road vehicles waiting at the farm track, and the corruption of James Harker, Holmes added, to ensure that Robert Fleck's report went nowhere. Yes, this operation was planned by someone with intimate knowledge of the Great Northern Railway, access to its yards and its scheduling, and either considerable financial resources of their own, or backing from someone who has them. He set down his pipe. We must now determine who wished to get their hands on Lord Ambrose Castleton badly enough to execute the most audacious railway crime in the history of England. Watson, I shall need the files on the current state of the Grimthorpe coalfields, and I believe a visit to Lord Castleton's London solicitors would be instructive, even in his lordship's absence. Chapter 8. The Shadow Behind Castleton. Lord Ambrose Castleton's London solicitors occupied a dignified set of chambers in Gray's Inn, where a senior partner named Mr. Horace Fellows received Holmes and Watson with the mixture of distress and professional caution characteristic of a man whose most important client has vanished from a moving train. Lord Castleton's affairs are, of course, highly confidential, Fellows began. Of course, Holmes agreed, and I have no interest in them except insofar as they explain why someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to abduct him. You may spare yourself the ethical discomfort of a decision, Mr. Fellows, by simply confirming or denying certain hypotheses I have already formed. Fellows blinked. Aye, very well. Holmes's hypotheses, presented in rapid succession, proved comprehensively accurate. Castleton was indeed involved in a dispute, a rather serious one, over mineral rights to a seam of coal beneath a tract of land that straddled the border between two estates in Northumberland. The dispute had been in litigation for 3 years, and was approaching a resolution that would, by most assessments, favour Castleton's claim. The opposing interest was a consortium of investors operating through a company incorporated in Edinburgh under the name of the Caledonian Industrial Development Trust. And Mr. Price? Holmes asked. Samuel Price, who was also on the 947. Fellows paled perceptibly. Mr. Price is a surveyor employed by our chambers. He was carrying the certified survey documents that formed the critical evidence in Lord Castleton's favour. Documents that, if they were to be lost or if Lord Castleton were to be held incommunicado during the final hearing next Monday, would result in the case being decided by default in the consortium's favour. And the hearing, Holmes said quietly, cannot be postponed. The presiding judge is Sir Edmund Rawley. He is known for an extreme antipathy toward postponements on grounds other than medical emergency. One more question, Mr. Fellows. The Caledonian Industrial Development Trust. Whose interest does it represent? Who are its principals? Fellows hesitated for a long moment. Then he said, with the manner of a man stepping carefully onto uncertain ice, the trust is a complex structure, but the individual who established it, and who holds controlling interest through a series of intermediary vehicles, is a man named Cornelius Vane. Watson looked up sharply from his notebook. Holmes did not visibly react, but the quality of his stillness changed in a way that Watson had learned to read as the moment at which everything assembles itself into a coherent picture. Inspector Cornelius Vane, Holmes said, of the Grimthorpe Constabulary. I was not aware he held a police appointment, Fellows said uncomfortably. I know him only as a businessman. He holds both positions rather adroitly, Holmes said, rising. Watson, we must return to Baker Street immediately, and I think it would be wise to send a rather urgent telegram to Lestrade. In the cab, Holmes sat in absolute silence for fully 5 minutes. Then he said, Vane was there when we arrived at Grimthorpe. He was present at every stage of our initial investigation. He heard everything I said about the siding, the chemical evidence, the canvas bags. He knows precisely how much we know. Then the passengers may be moved. Or worse, yes. Holmes leaned forward and spoke through the cab window. Faster, please, as fast as you can manage. Chapter 9. The trap is baited back at Baker Street. Holmes moved with the focused intensity of a man who has decided that the time for gathering information is over and the time for action has arrived. He sent 3 telegrams, to Lestrade, to the Great Northern Railway's head of security, and to a person whose identity he declined to share with Watson, and then stood at his desk for 10 minutes, conducting what Watson could only describe as an internal conversation, his lips occasionally moving without sound. There are 2 problems, Holmes said at last. The first is finding where the passengers are being held. The second is ensuring that Vane cannot destroy the evidence or harm them before we reach that location. Both problems require that Vane believe himself undetected for a little while longer. But he saw us at Grimthorpe. He knows we're investigating. He knows a great deal, yes. But there is one thing he does not know. That Clara Fleck came to us, and that her father's list names 6 of the 7 individuals Vane needed to corrupt to execute this plan. That list can be verified independently, and it gives Lestrade legal authority to detain 6 of those individuals simultaneously, which will cut Vane's communication with his operation at the source. Holmes took up his violin and played 3 discordant notes that seemed to represent thoughts rather than music. What I need is the location. The farm track led to a secondary road east of the siding. The wagons, 6 large vehicles carrying perhaps 90 to 100 unconscious passengers, cannot have travelled far. A convoy of that nature, even in the early hours, on roads that unfamiliar. They needed a destination prepared in advance, close to the railway line. He spread the Ordnance Survey map on the table again and bent over it with a magnifying glass. Watson watched him move the glass in slow, systematic sweeps, pausing occasionally. Large property, Holmes murmured. Isolated. Within 8 miles of that siding, to allow for road travel of an hour or less with a heavy convoy. With sufficient outbuildings or enclosed structures to conceal 100+ individuals. With some connection to Vane's interests. He straightened. Watson, the Caledonian Industrial Development Trust. Fellows said it was established to pursue interests in the Grimthorpe coalfields. That means property acquisition. Vane has been buying land in that area. He went to his desk and consulted a volume that Watson recognized as Crockford's combined with a directory of land registrations he knew Holmes had obtained some months earlier, in connection with an entirely different case. He paged through it with focused speed. Here, he said, Hartsmore Farm, 7 miles east-northeast of the Barton siding. Registered in the name of a company called Northern Holdings Limited, which shares a registered address with the Caledonian Industrial Development Trust. The property is described as a former colliery farm with extensive stone buildings. It has been unoccupied by any agricultural tenancy for 18 months. Holmes closed the volume. That is where they are. He turned to Watson with an expression that combined absolute certainty with complete calm. There is one more thing required before we move. Vane must be held at Grimthorpe and prevented from issuing instructions to whoever is guarding the farm. I need someone to occupy his attention for precisely long enough. Holmes picked up his hat. Which is why I shall not be going to Hartsmoor Farm tonight. You, Lestrade, and a substantial contingent of the railway constabulary will go to Hartsmoor Farm. I am going to Grimthorpe to visit Inspector Vane. Watson looked at him steadily. And what precisely are you going to Grimthorpe to do? Holmes smiled, the rare, genuine variety. To confess that I have reached a dead end and would value his assistance. I shall be extremely humble, Watson. It will be very convincing. Chapter 10. The Descent upon Hartsmoor. Watson had participated in a number of police operations during his years with Holmes, but none had possessed quite the peculiar combination of tension and logistical complexity of the descent upon Hartsmoor Farm. Lestrade had assembled a force of 14 men, 8 from Scotland Yard's detective division and 6 from the Great Northern Railway's own constabulary, under their Inspector Graves, a solid and undemonstrative man who had arrived in response to Holmes's telegram with the practicality of someone who had been waiting for a concrete course of action. They travelled in 4 carriages and a police wagon, moving without lanterns once they left the main road, guided by Watson's careful reading of the Ordnance Survey and Graves's local knowledge of the secondary roads east of the railway line. The night was cold and still, the fog having thinned to a mere atmospheric gauze, through which the stars were dimly visible. Hartsmoor Farm resolved itself from the darkness as a low, dark mass of stone buildings arranged around a central yard. The farmhouse itself appeared unoccupied, no lights in the upper windows. But 2 of the outbuildings, long, low structures that might once have housed equipment or livestock, showed thin slivers of light at their doors and windows. And in the yard Watson could make out the shapes of several large wagons, still loaded with their canvas covers. Lestrade deployed his men with quiet efficiency that Watson generously attributed partly to Holmes's detailed written instructions, which had been pressed into the inspector's hand at Baker Street. 2 constables went to each exit from the farmyard. 3 men went directly to the wagons. Lestrade, Watson, and Graves approached the nearest outbuilding. The door was locked from the outside, a substantial hasp and padlock. Graves produced bolt cutters with the businesslike air of a man who has learned from experience. The door swung open on a scene that Watson would describe in his notes as, simultaneously, a relief and an outrage. The building's interior had been fitted with rough timber bunks in double rows, clearly constructed specifically for this purpose, and on those bunks lay the passengers of the 947 from Grimthorpe, most of them sleeping with the deep, slow breathing of the chemically sedated, though a number near the door had begun to stir, their eyes opening with the bewildered slow-motion confusion of those emerging from unnatural sleep. Watson entered immediately in his professional capacity, moving from bunk to bunk with his medical bag open. The 4 guards who had been sitting at a rough table near the building's far wall rose in alarm, then found themselves face to face with 8 constables in a confined space, which rendered resistance a purely theoretical option. In the second building, the configuration was similar. Castleton, his secretary Hume, Miss Ashworth, and Price. With his documents, Watson was relieved to note, still in the leather satchel beside him, were all present, sedated but apparently unharmed. The train's crew, Fleck, Poole, the 2 conductors, occupied a separated section, bound but conscious. Fleck, upon seeing Watson, said 3 words with considerable feeling that Watson chose not to record in his notebook. The passengers were, as Holmes had predicted, physically unharmed. Many were deeply shaken, all were confused, and several were in the early stages of recovering from the effects of the sedative, disoriented, nauseated, and possessed of the particular anger of people who have been deprived of consciousness and autonomy without consent. Watson worked through the night with the calm, systematic application of care that the situation demanded, assisted by 3 constables who proved surprisingly useful. The guards yielded one crucial piece of information before Lestrade separated them for individual questioning. They were employed by a man named Desmond Wetherall and had been paid in advance. Wetherall himself was not present at the farm. Chapter 11. Holmes and the Inspector. What passed between Holmes and Cornelius Vane in the Grimthorpe police station between 10 o'clock and midnight on the night of the Hartsmoor operation was reconstructed by Watson from Holmes's subsequent account, delivered with the modest understatement that was Holmes's characteristic mode when describing his own rather brilliant pieces of theatre. Holmes had arrived at the Grimthorpe station presenting himself as a man deflated. He had been wrong about the siding, he explained to a visibly relieved Vane. The chemical evidence in the carriages had proven inconclusive. The farm track led nowhere of significance. He had formed a theory that now appeared baseless, and he was, frankly, at a loss. Vane had received this information with the careful, controlled satisfaction of a man who has been holding his breath and is now permitted to exhale. He had offered Holmes tea, expressed sympathy, and suggested, with the magnanimous helpfulness of someone who considers himself now the senior intelligence in the room, that the case might more productively be approached as a mass disappearance rather than an organized abduction. Holmes had agreed with every appearance of grateful relief, and had spent an hour asking questions that managed to be simultaneously innocuous and, as he explained to Watson, quietly devastating in their capacity to fix Vane in a single location without any communication to the outside world. The questions required Vane's direct attention, the consultation of station records, the physical retrieval of documents from files. Each request was entirely reasonable. Collectively, they ensured that Vane was occupied, present, and completely unable to make any private communication. At 11:53, a telegram arrived for Holmes at the station, from Watson, confirming the successful resolution at Hartsmoor Farm. Holmes read it, folded it precisely, and placed it in his pocket. "I think," he said to Vane, with the quiet pleasantness of a man who has been enjoying himself rather more than he has appeared, "that we may now dispense with the pretense." Vane's face, Holmes reported, went through a rapid and instructive sequence of expressions: confusion, calculation, realization, and finally a settled blankness that Holmes identified as the look of an intelligent person accepting a situation they cannot alter. "What pretense?" Vane said. "The one in which you are a police inspector assisting an investigation, rather than the architect of the crime under investigation." Holmes produced the folded telegram. "Hartsmoor Farm is currently occupied by Lestrade and 14 officers. Your guards are in custody, and all 117 passengers of the 947 are recovered and safe. The documents belonging to Samuel Price are intact. Lord Castleton's hearing will proceed on Monday as scheduled." He placed the telegram on the desk between them. "You are, I should think, a man of considerable intelligence, Vane. Intelligent enough to know that what you constructed was genuinely impressive, and intelligent enough to know that impressive is not the same as successful." Holmes rose. "There are 2 constables outside this building who are going to come in presently. I suggest you do not make their job more difficult than it needs to be." The constables, railway constabulary, telegraphed ahead by Holmes, entered 4 minutes later and arrested Cornelius Vane without incident. Desmond Wetherall was apprehended 3 days later, attempting to leave England at Dover, having been identified from Fleck's description and the names in the deceased list. James Harker, the depot foreman, surrendered voluntarily upon being informed of the scale of the evidence against him. The 6 remaining names on Fleck's list were detained on the same night as the Hartsmoor operation, and each proved willing to provide detailed information in exchange for considerations that Watson understood were part of Lestrade's negotiations. Chapter 12. The Reconstruction. 3 days after the recovery of the passengers, with the principals in custody and the immediate operational demands satisfied, Holmes gathered Watson, Lestrade, Graves, and Crane, who had requested the meeting himself, with a quiet desperation that Holmes found entirely reasonable, in the sitting room at Baker Street. and conducted the full reconstruction that Watson had been awaiting with the patient eagerness of a man who has been handed the first chapter of a book, and the last, and has been waiting to read the middle. The operation, Holmes explained, had been planned by Vane over a period of approximately 8 months. Its objective was the removal of Lord Castleton and Samuel Price from the situation in time for Monday's hearing, combined with the physical seizure of Price's survey documents, which would allow the Caledonian Trust's legal representatives to enter the hearing unopposed and claim the Northumberland mineral rights by default. The operational plan had required the corruption of 6 railway employees who collectively controlled the scheduling of the 947's rolling stock, ensuring the specific carriages, already modified with Weatherall's gas delivery system, were assigned to that service. The signalling protocols at 2 specific signal boxes between Grimthorpe and London, the locomotive yard access at Grimthorpe, where Weatherall's mechanical team had installed the throttle disengagement device, and the station security reporting chain via Harker to suppress Fleck's complaint. The actual execution had proceeded as follows. The gas system, activated by a timer installed beneath the carriage floors by Weatherall's team during the previous night's yard access, had been set to release at precisely the point when the train entered the Barton cutting, approximately 7 minutes south of Grimthorpe. The locomotive throttle block had been designed to disengage automatically when the gas released, bringing the train to a controlled halt on the gradient within the cutting. The entire stop had lasted approximately 14 minutes, within the variance of normal express travel time when the fog reduction of speed was considered, and occurring in a section of line where both signal boxes were engaged with other traffic on adjacent lines, their attention deliberately drawn there by manipulation of the signalling sequence. Weatherall's crew of 14 had worked the carriages systematically during the 14 minutes, transferring unconscious passengers to the wagons waiting in the tree line. The locomotive crew had been rendered insensible first by a separate mechanism, a canister attached to the cab's ventilation intake, remotely triggered by Weatherall himself, who had ridden in the first carriage. Once the transfer was complete, the throttle block was released by manual override. The locomotive had resumed motion under its own momentum, and the crew, still insensible, had ridden the train into King's Cross, where it arrived under gravity-assisted deceleration and the automatic track circuit braking that the signal system engaged as it entered the terminus. "The shapes at Finsbury Park," Watson said. "The platform supervisor said he saw shapes in the windows." "Mannequins," Holmes said. "Rough ones, padded clothing stuffed with newspaper, positioned in the window seats, sufficient at speed in fog to pass as a casual observation." Holmes paused. The one element that was not anticipated was Robert Fleck. They had attempted to buy his cooperation. He refused and reported it. They corrupted Harker to suppress the report, but they did not know that Fleck kept his own record or that he shared it with his daughter. That record provided the thread that unravelled the entire enterprise, Crane said, with the controlled emotion of a man who has been responsible for something extraordinary and is only now fully understanding its dimensions. "My God, the planning of it." "Yes," Holmes agreed. "It was extraordinary planning. It was also, in the end, somewhat mechanically overcomplicated. Every additional element of complexity is an additional opportunity for failure. The scheme depended on too many people, too many moving parts, and the fundamental error of underestimating Robert Fleck's integrity." He tapped his fingers on the arm of his chair. "A man who will not be bought is, in the long run, more dangerous to a criminal enterprise than any detective." Chapter 13. What was left behind. The legal proceedings that followed were, as Watson noted in his records, among the more extensively covered criminal trials of that decade. Vane was charged with conspiracy, wrongful imprisonment, and a comprehensive list of offences that his counsel attempted to reduce through various procedural manoeuvres, and was largely unsuccessful. Weatherall received the more direct charges associated with the physical execution of the abduction. Harker pleaded to a reduced charge and received a reduced sentence. The 6 railway employees received a variety of penalties commensurate with the significance of their individual roles, the quality of their cooperation, and the sympathies of their respective counsel. Lord Castleton's hearing proceeded on the Monday as scheduled, with Samuel Price's documents intact and properly presented. The Caledonian Trust's legal representatives were not in a position to offer much by way of contest, their client being at that point in custody. Castleton won his mineral rights, though Watson understood from a subsequent note from Mr. Fellows that his lordship intended to donate a portion of the proceeds to the establishment of a railway workers' charitable fund, a gesture that Watson found unexpectedly moving. Miss Dorothea Ashworth recovered fully from the sedative's after-effects and wrote a letter to Baker Street that was both grateful and rather witty. Watson reread it several times. Robert Fleck returned to work 3 weeks after the events described, having been cleared of any association with the conspiracy, and reinstated with considerable formal ceremony by the Great Northern Railway's Board of Directors, who presented him with a testimonial watch. He was deeply embarrassed by the ceremony, and deeply pleased by the watch, which was the correct proportion of responses for a man of his character. Clara Fleck wrote to Holmes from the country house of her aunt, where she had followed his instructions with a literalness that had kept her safely isolated from the events until their conclusion. She returned to London when Holmes telegraphed that the matter was closed, and she came to Baker Street on a bright Thursday morning to collect her father's list, which Holmes returned to her in a small envelope with only the observation that she was welcome to keep it as evidence of her father's principled stubbornness, which he considered among the finer qualities a person could possess. She thanked him, shook Watson's hand, and left with the direct composure that had characterized her from the start. Watson thought, but did not say, that she was quite remarkable. There remained one thread that Watson found himself returning to in the days after the case's resolution. The child's wooden horse, sitting on the window ledge of the second carriage. He had asked Lestrade about it, and Lestrade had confirmed that it had been returned, with the other unclaimed articles, to the Lost Property Office at King's Cross. Watson found himself wondering about the child it belonged to, and whether the child had been among the passengers, and whether the recovery had included a reunion with the toy whose patient, painted watchfulness had accompanied them through those first bewildering hours at the silent terminus. He asked Lestrade to check. The answer came back, yes. A girl of 7 recovered at Hartsmoor with her mother, both of them physically unharmed. She had been sleeping peacefully, the farm's guards had reported with what sounded like reluctant admiration, when the constables entered. She had asked for her horse before she asked for anything else. Watson recorded this fact in his notes without further comment, though he underlined it once with considerable deliberateness. Chapter 14. The Doctor's Contemplation. Watson spent the Sunday following the case's conclusion in a mood of reflective satisfaction that he recognized as the particular aftermath of a Holmes investigation. That state in which the elegance of the solution, now fully visible, cast the entire preceding confusion into a kind of retrospective order that felt almost aesthetic. He sat by the window of Baker Street with his notes spread around him and the fire burning well, and he attempted to write a preliminary account of the case with the thoroughness he knew it deserved. Holmes, predictably, was not present. He had been absent since the previous morning, leaving only a note indicating that he was pursuing an inquiry of a separate nature and would return when it proved either productive or definitively fruitless. Watson, who had long ago made his peace with the fact that Holmes's concept of recreational time was not identical to anyone else's, simply added coal to the fire and wrote on. What struck Watson, as he reviewed the sequence of events, was the degree to which the case had turned not on Holmes's genius, though that had been, as always, both indispensable and impressive, but on the character of an ordinary man. Robert Fleck had been offered money to be silent and had declined. He had made a report and been ignored. He had gone home and written down what he knew, and given it to his daughter, and told her it was probably nothing. And in that unspectacular sequence of unremarkable moral choices, he had handed Holmes the thread that unravelled everything. Watson thought about this at some length. Holmes, he knew, would have found the observation sentimental, and would have countered that Fleck's actions were rationally the correct ones and required no special comment. But Watson was a doctor, and he spent his professional life in proximity to the full range of human decision-making under pressure, and he had long since come to believe that the absence of corruption, in a world that provided sufficient inducement to corruption, was not a small thing. He wrote, "There are cases in which Holmes's brilliance is the pivot upon which events turn, and there are cases in which events have already turned, quietly and without ceremony, before Holmes arrives, turned by the choice of someone far removed from Baker Street, with no audience, no recognition, and no certainty that the choice would make any difference. This was such a case." He crossed out the last sentence, feeling it was too neat. Then he wrote it back in. When Holmes returned at 7:30, looking faintly pleased with himself and smelling of river fog and tobacco, Watson was still at the window. Holmes glanced at the spread of notes, poured himself a glass of brandy without ceremony, and dropped into his chair. "The account is coming along?" he asked. "Slowly," Watson said. "I find myself wanting to do it justice." "You invariably do, and you invariably succeed," Holmes said, with the brief, genuine warmth that he deployed only when he did not appear to be aware of it. "Though I wish you would resist the impulse to describe my methods as brilliant. Careful and systematic is closer to the truth." "I shall take that under advisement," Watson said dryly. Holmes stretched his legs toward the fire. "The new case," he said, "is rather interesting. A clockmaker in Bermondsey who claims that one of his clocks has been running backward for 6 days. He has tried 3 different mechanisms, and the phenomenon persists. The supernatural hypothesis does not, of course, engage me. The rather more fascinating engineering hypothesis does." Watson noted this in the margin of his notebook, below the crossed-out sentence. "When do we go to Bermondsey?" "Tomorrow morning, early." Holmes picked up his violin. "Get some sleep, Watson. Your account will be the better for it." Watson gathered his papers and said good night. On the stairs, he heard Holmes begin to play, not the discordant thinking music, but something with structure and intention, something that moved through the foggy London night with the patient confidence of a thing that knows where it is going. Chapter 15. What Holmes knew and when he knew it. Watson's account of the case was, by his own subsequent assessment, incomplete in one significant respect. It did not record the full chronology of Holmes's reasoning, because Holmes himself did not provide it until some weeks later, in the course of an evening when both men had dined well and the subject arose naturally from a conversation about misdirection. "There was a moment," Holmes said, staring at the fire, "that I did not share with you at the time, because I was not certain it was significant, and because sharing it would have altered your observations in ways that might have compromised their value." Watson set down his glass. "When was this?" "At King's Cross, in the second carriage. You were recording the contents of the compartments, and I was examining the floor. I told you I found the chemical residue. That is true. But I found something else first." Holmes reached into his desk drawer and produced a small evidence envelope, which he passed to Watson. Inside was a single cufflink, small, oval silver, with an engraved design, a stylized thistle, above which a small coronet had been worked into the metal. "A Scottish motif," Watson said, "and a coronet suggesting a baronetcy or a claim to one. The thistle, worked in that specific heraldic style, is associated with a particular group of families who were involved in the early development of the Scottish coalfields. It is not a common design. I identified it that night at King's Cross, but chose not to share the identification until I had confirmed it. And its presence in the carriage? It fell, or was dropped, in the compartment nearest the door of the second carriage. The compartment where I believe Wetherall stationed himself for the duration of the journey, in order to manually trigger the locomotive canister at the correct moment. Holmes reclaimed the envelope. It confirmed for me, before we went to Grimthorpe, that the operation had a Scottish industrial connection, which meant Castleton's dispute was already in my mind when Vane mentioned it, and Vane's name, appearing before me at Grimthorpe as a police inspector, when it was already connected in my index to the Caledonian Trust, was what I needed to see. Watson thought about this. You knew Vane was involved when we first met him at Grimthorpe. I strongly suspected it. I was not certain until Fellows confirmed the Trust's ownership structure. The cufflink was the first indicator. Vane's presence and manner at the investigation was the second. Fellows was the third. 3 concurrent indicators pointing in the same direction satisfy even my requirements for certainty. Holmes paused. The reason I did not tell you was rather more straightforward than strategic. At that stage, I did not know whether Vane had colleagues within the railway or the constabulary who might have observed your reactions had you known what I suspected. Your genuine puzzlement at Grimthorpe was its own form of protection. Watson absorbed this for a moment. So while I was genuinely baffled, you were playing the long game, Holmes said simply, as the situation required. Watson was briefly and mildly irritated by this, in the way of a man who has spent several days in productive bewilderment, and has now been informed that his companion had a map the whole time. Then he was, as usual, compelled to acknowledge that Holmes had been right. His genuine bewilderment at Grimthorpe had been as authentic as it looked, and had served its purpose. Next time, Watson said, I should appreciate being told that I am being used as a prop in the second act, at least by the third. Holmes raised an eyebrow. That is a perfectly reasonable request. I shall almost certainly fail to comply with it, but I give you my word that the failure will always be in your best interests. He paused. Within the reasonable limits of my capacity to predict best interests in real time. Holmes. Watson. Thank you for telling me now. Holmes nodded once, with the slight formality he employed when a genuine acknowledgement was the appropriate response, and he was making an effort to deliver it properly. He refilled Watson's glass without being asked. Outside, London hummed with its November self, the cabs and the cries, and the distant rhythm of a city too large to be entirely still. The fire burned well. Chapter 16. The Platform at 7:30. Some 3 weeks after the events described, Watson was passing through King's Cross Station on an unrelated errand when he found himself walking the length of Platform 7 with the involuntary attentiveness of a man returning to a place where something significant has occurred. The platform was ordinary in the afternoon light. Passengers moved along it with the unconcerned purpose of people for whom a railway platform is simply a means of arriving at the next moment. The Great Northern Express stood at the far end, not the 9:47, but a later service, a different locomotive, a different crew, its engine breathing quietly in the cool air. Watson stood at the point where Fenwick had met Holmes 3 weeks before and tried to locate the texture of that first night. The roped cordon, the silently waiting train, the little wooden horse in the window of the second carriage. He could not quite find it. The ordinary afternoon had covered it over completely, as ordinary afternoons are inclined to do. He was about to leave when he heard his name called, and turned to find Robert Fleck walking toward him from the direction of the locomotive sheds, in his driver's uniform, his cap slightly askew, the testimonial watch chain visible at his waistcoat pocket. "Dr. Watson," Fleck said, extending a hand that Watson shook warmly. "I thought I recognized you. I heard you'd been here that first night." "I was. Your daughter told us a great deal that proved essential, Mr. Fleck." Fleck smiled, a quiet, satisfied smile of the kind Watson associated with men who have been vindicated by events rather than by argument. "Clara's a sensible girl, always has been." He looked along the length of the platform. "I'm back on the Grimthorpe run, different schedule, the 7:15. I was a bit nervous the first morning, I won't deny it. But you get back on, don't you?" "You do," Watson agreed. Fleck was quiet for a moment, watching the express at the platform end. "What I keep thinking about," he said, "is that it almost worked. All those months of planning, all that money, and it came apart because I wrote down some names on a piece of paper." He shook his head slowly. "Funny thing." "Not so funny," Watson said. "Mr. Holmes has a theory that the weakest point in any criminal enterprise is not its technical complexity, but its human reliability. A single person who refuses to be what the plan needs them to be, that is, reliably corrupt, can undo the most elaborate scheme imaginable. Fleck considered this. "Your Mr. Holmes," he said, with a small grin, "is a very clever man, but I'd say it's simpler than his theory makes it sound. I just didn't like the way that fellow talked to me." Watson laughed, genuinely, fully, in the open air of the station, and Fleck laughed with him, and the sound of it travelled down platform 7 and disappeared into the ordinary, excellent, continuing noise of London going about its business. Watson raised his hat as Fleck headed back toward the locomotive sheds, and then he walked out through the great arch of King's Cross into the grey November afternoon, thinking that he had something to add to his account after all. He wrote it that evening, sitting by the fire while Holmes read, a single paragraph at the end of what had become a rather substantial manuscript. Holmes is accustomed to crediting the resolution of a case to careful observation, logical inference, and the application of method to evidence. He is not wrong to do so, but there is a prior act without which no method can operate, the act of refusing, at some quiet, unobserved, unrewarded moment, to participate in the thing that is being constructed around you. Robert Fleck did not refuse the bribe because he had calculated the odds, or because he expected recognition, or because he anticipated that the thread of his refusal would one day be taken up by a detective in Baker Street and pulled until the whole conspiracy unravelled. He refused because he knew, in the immediate and uncomplicated way of a man at home in his own conscience, that it was the wrong thing. I have attended Holmes on many remarkable cases, and I find, in the end, that the most remarkable element in this one was not the detective's genius, but the driver's integrity, which is, perhaps, less rare than we sometimes fear, and rather less celebrated than it deserves to be. Holmes read this paragraph over Watson's shoulder without comment. He returned to his chair, picked up his book, and read 2 pages. Then he said, without looking up, "You may be right," which was, Watson reflected, as close to a concession as the case was likely to produce, and sufficient. The end.